March 21st, 1918, the German Empire launches its final offensive of the Great War in an attempt to secure victory before the full might of the United States is unleashed upon them. General Hindenburg, who had won many battles against the Russians, was the main driving force behind the offensive. The operation saw initial success, but for every blow they inflicted on the Allies, the Germans grew weak and tired, while their enemies were bolstered by fresh troops. The Germans, weakened by blockade and exhausted from the fighting, were ultimately unable to defeat the Allies and began retreating all across the front. It was a certainty that they had lost the war. In an attempt to lessen the consequences of defeat, generals such as Hindenburg and Ludendorff urged the Kaiser to create a new and more liberal government, believing that they would have better odds at the negotiating table and to deflect blame away from them and the Kaiser. Despite securing an armistice with the Allies, the German army was unable to secure the home front, which was about to erupt in a wave of revolutionary violence that would mark the start of a very difficult era in German history. On the 3rd of November, just over a week before the armistice was supposed to be signed, German sailors revolted against their officers, whom wanted to send the fleet on a suicidal showdown with the Allies. Initially, the protest was contained and 600 sailors were detained. However, they were soon joined by 100,000 more, whom liberated them and even occupied the city of Kiel. This was the start of the German Revolution of 1918 that saw the end of the German Empire. All throughout Germany, millions of people joined in on the uprising, motivated by the desire for peace and democratic reform. While it wasn't widely supported, even by the working class, the far left, represented by the Spartacists, who later formed the KPD, sought to bring upon a social revolution similar to that of Russia. The Social Democratic Party, which had seen great success adhering to the law, was the main driving force of German democracy during this period. Horrified at what Lenin and his secret police, the Cheka, had unleashed upon Russia, the Social Democrats mounted a fierce opposition against the communists who had little regard for democratic principles. With the army falling apart and unwilling to stop the revolution, Kaiser Wilhelm, along with the royalty of other German states, were forced to abdicate and hand over control to a civilian government. The SPD, the Center Party, and the Democrats led by Friedrich Ebert formed what was called the Council of People's Representatives to face the task of not only building a new democracy, but also signing the armistice with the Allies. On the 11th of November that year, World War I finally came to an end. Millions of soldiers came back home from the front to a new but impoverished Germany. Most tried to find their way back into civilian life, but many couldn't give up the military lifestyle. Demobilized soldiers went on to form many veterans and paramilitary organizations such as the Reichsbanner, the Steel Helmet, and the League of Red Front Combatants. Most infamously were the various Freikorps units of the early Weimar Republic. These private armies were mostly made up of former shock troops, ex-officers, and young men who missed out on the opportunity to fight in the Great War. Initially, they fought against the Poles and the Soviets, but soon turned their bayonets on their fellow compatriots. Despite their far-right tendencies and their hostility to parliamentary democracy, they essentially acted as auxiliaries for the new republic. It wouldn't be long till the Freikorps were called to put down rebellion. On the 5th of January, 1919, the KPD, Spartacist League, and the Independent Social Democrats launched a poorly planned revolt known as the Spartacist Uprising in Berlin. The Reichswehr, along with the Freikorps, were dispatched to restore order. Over the course of several days, the rebels were beaten back, and order was restored to the capital. The Freikorps were as efficient as they were brutal. Rebel prisoners and communist sympathizers all over the country were beaten and summarily executed. Communist leaders, such as Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, were executed as well. The SPD most likely could have formed a proper army of their own by mobilizing the workers, but they were persuaded not to do so under the threat of scaring off their allies, who may not like the idea of giving guns to their underpaid factory workers. For now, they would have to rely on the Freikorps, but would soon find out that they weren't entirely to be trusted. The Council of People's Representatives finally managed to organize an election for a constitutional assembly. The SPD, Center Party, and the Democratic Party gained the majority of the votes, and Friedrich Ebert later became president. The assembly met for the first time in February 1919 in the city of Weimar, hence why it's called the Weimar Republic. There, the assembly began to redact a new constitution, which was then approved on the 13th of July that year. It was basically a modified version of a proposed constitution by Bismarck back in the day. The Reichstag took upon the role of legislation, and that of the Kaiser was given to an elected president and was given exceptional powers by Article 48 of the Constitution, which allowed him to govern by decree and use the army to restore order by force if necessary. Other than that, the Constitution of the Weimar Republic included elements from the UK, USA, France, and Switzerland. It was a constitution designed for a democratic people. The greatest flaw with it was not the constitution itself, but the fact that political knowledge lagged behind it. While the pro-democracy factions initially gained a majority in the Weimar Republic, they would lose many of their positions in subsequent elections to the far right and the far left. On the right, you had conservatives, monarchists, and, most concerning of all, nationalists such as a certain party that we'll get into soon. These factions had little sympathy for parliamentary democracy and longed for the return of the Kaiser. Even if they had accepted the fact that the Kaiser was gone, they still leaned towards authoritarianism, reminiscing upon the days when a political strongman such as Bismarck forged the great German Empire. The communists, led by the KPD, were just as authoritarian as the far right, except in their case, the dictatorship that they wanted was in the name of the workers. Ironically, they also voted against the same legislative proposals as the far right, ultimately facilitating the rise of their sworn enemies. The state apparatus that the Republic had inherited wasn't much better. The new state's employees had almost all been instructed under the German Empire and were accustomed to an authoritarian style of government. On top of that, their loyalties were doubtful, with many of them being hostile towards democracy. From the very beginning, the Weimar Republic set sail on a running boat into a storm that would ultimately destroy it. Before Germany could formally end World War I and even approve of a new constitution, the country once again had to deal with revolt. In the southern state of Bavaria, a group of communists and anarchists led by Ernst Toller declared on the 6th of April a Soviet government in Bavaria. Once again, the Reichswehr along with the Freikorps were called in to put an end to the revolt. The hastily organized Red Army was unable to hold back the coming onslaught. After the assassination of one of their leaders, the rebels executed 10 of their hostages in an act of revenge and desperation. The Freikorps, enraged by this, began an orgy of violence in Munich, killing and torturing both rebel prisoners and communist sympathizers. In one particularly violent display, drunken members of the Freikorps broke up a meeting of Catholic artisans, whom they'd been misled into believing were communist revolutionaries. The detainees were then brought down into the basement of the building they were in, where the soldiers beat them all to a bloody pulp, killing 21 of them. After purging Bavaria of Soviet power, far-right nationalists would turn the state into their own little stronghold. Wanting to avoid further revolt, the soldiers of the Reichswehr, who were stationed in the area, underwent forced political indoctrination. One of these men, who at one point had worn a red armband and attended revolutionary protests, was now on his way to change the course of world history. Germany, having lost the war, was now at the mercy of the Allies. To put a definitive end to World War I, the Weimar Republic signed the Treaty of Versailles. To name a few conditions, the treaty resulted in Germany losing a sizable portion of its territory. The recognition of the new European states made out of it, such as Poland, the left bank of the Rhine was demilitarized, the military reduced to 100,000 men and stripped of modern vehicles, and the country would be forced to pay reparations that were yet to be specified. The conditions should have come as no surprise, considering that they had done the same with Russia with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and the subsequent exploitation of the conquered peoples of the East. Not only that, but had Germany won in the West, it is very likely that their terms would have meant greater territorial losses and reparations for the defeated Allies. Lacking complete self-awareness, the Germans, especially the nationalists, were horrified by the terms and resented the government officials that had signed it, calling them the November criminals. Many in Germany began to undergo a process that we call coping, soothing, and molding. Hardcore patriots and nationalists such as Ludendorff and Hindenburg couldn't accept the fact that trying to beat multiple world powers at once is simply impossible, a lesson that would take the Germans another ass-kicking to finally learn. For the meantime, many of them started looking for scapegoats to blame for their defeat. They found them in the form of the Communists, the Social Democrats, and, last but not least, the Jews. According to them, these three groups had been orchestrating Germany's defeat, while the valiant soldiers of the Reich spilt their blood in the trenches, only to be stabbed in the back. This theory completely ignores the fact that the Social Democrats in their majority supported the war effort, and that 100,000 Germans of Jewish faith fought in the army, of which 12,000 gave their lives for their country. While the Communists did oppose the war effort, it was largely futile due to their lack of resources and support. It wasn't until the war was over that they acted, and even then, their pathetic attempts at revolution were easily crushed. Besides, we all know it was Argentina's fault. Already dissatisfied with the Republic, the Freikorps believed that it was no longer necessary to come to agreements with Germany's democratic forces. On the 13th of March, 1920, Freikorps and Reichswehr units led by Wolfgang Kapp began a march on Berlin to oust the elected government and install a new regime based on the model of the old monarchy. In 1917, Kapp was one of the founders of the German Fatherland Party, of which its program was based on annexation, authoritarian reforms, and pan-Germanism. Its members consisted of teachers, Protestant pastors, army officers, and other elements of the German elite. However, they failed to gain the support of the masses. Initially, the coup seemed to be going well, and were able to reach Berlin without any difficulties. The Reichswehr and the remaining Freikorps members, whom had obediently put down the revolts of the far left, just stood by and watched as things happened. Before fleeing to the city of Dresden, the government called for a general strike to oppose the coup. The trade unions and civil servants answered the call and paralyzed the country. Even though they had hated the Republic, the communists also joined, going as far as to form a Red Army of 50,000 soldiers in the Ruhr. Even though the coup was successfully defeated by the general strike, most of its instigators were given amnesty, and the Reichswehr began an offensive against the Ruhr Red Army in an event that can only be described as a regional civil war in the Ruhr, resulting in the deaths of thousands. The governing coalition also suffered a serious defeat in the Reichstag elections of June 6th, losing their majority as anti-democracy factions gained power. In 1921, the Allies came to a decision on how much Germany should give them in reparations. The total sum was placed at 269 billion Goldmarks, payable over the course of 42 years, then at 132 billion Goldmarks, payable over the course of 37 years. The money that Germany was to pay corresponded with the resources that they had available. Considering the damage caused to the occupied territories of France and Belgium, these reparations weren't irrational. However, it didn't mean that they'd be easy to pay off. Both during and after the war, the German economy wasn't in a particularly good situation. During the war, spending had been higher than income, and inflation was above desirable levels. To pay what they owed to the Allies, the government began printing large sums of money without the sufficient economic resources to back it up. In 1921, it would cost 263 marks for a dollar, and later 493 in July 1922. In August that year, inflation exploded, with 1,000 marks getting you a dollar, then 3,000 in October, and 7,000 in December. In 1923, inflation had gone up to ridiculous levels, reaching a peak of 4,200,000 to the dollar. Wages were destroyed, and prices would even change by the hour. Keeping track of the inflation rate became so important to everyday life that even children were aware of it. Even with the printing presses at full capacity, the Germans were still unable to pay reparations on time, also defaulting on their shipments of lumber, coal, and telegraph poles. On the 11th of January 1923, the French used this as an excuse to occupy the Ruhr. While the main objective was to secure reparations, it had a secondary long-term objective of separating the Ruhr from the rest of Germany by fomenting separatism. The only meaningful way to resist was via passive measures, such as going on strike and refusing to collaborate, but the risk of this was that you could be replaced by workers from France. Lots of Germans lost their jobs, and even entire mines were shut down. Those who took on more drastic measures against the French were even less successful. Worst of all, several resistance members were executed, and thousands were evicted from their homes. With times of economic hardship and national humiliation, people began seeking increasingly more radical alternatives of government. One party that people slowly began to follow as a form of protest was the National Socialist German Workers' Party, Nazi for short. The defining characteristic that separated them from other elements of the far right wasn't necessarily their ideology, but their leader. The same person who witnessed the brutal suppression of the Bavarian Soviets. He was the inbred cunt from Austria. We all know how the story goes. The fucker was inbred and his father beat him like a stepchild. His childhood is mostly irrelevant for this video, so we'll skip right to his time in Vienna. He arrived in the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the year 1907 with hopes of going to art school. This dream of his was destroyed after he was rejected from the school twice. With barely any money and no future, Alabama boy was forced to live in homeless shelters, selling homemade postcards for a few bucks. But the most influential part of his stay in Vienna was his exposure to anti-Semitic conspiracies. He spent lots of time reading leaflets, newspapers, and books that he could borrow or get for a cheap price. The mayor of the city, whom he supported, was also an outspoken anti-Semite. Over time, he would develop the belief that the so-called Aryan race was superior, that they were the conquerors of weaker peoples and forgers of great civilizations, while the Jews were their antipods, a displaced people motivated by self-interest. This is all absolute nonsense, of course. We all know that Chile is the best. One important thing to point out during this time, Hitler was at the bottom of the social hierarchy. The feeling of belonging to some exclusive club of superhumans most certainly brought comfort to this failure of a human being. Due to his German nationalist beliefs, the failed Austrian painter moved to Munich in the German Empire. It was also to avoid conscription back in Austria, a nation that he despised. When World War I broke out, he cheered at the declaration of war and enlisted in the German army. While most soldiers quickly succumbed to the horrors of trench warfare, young Adolf was having the time of his life. Serving the fatherland gave him purpose, and, to give him credit, he did so valiantly. He was injured on multiple occasions, but always made it back to the front. For his service, he was awarded the Knight's Cross 2nd and 1st class, and was eventually given the rank of Lance Corporal. After being hospitalized by a gas attack, he learned of Germany's defeat, an event that deeply affected him. He later wrote of the Revolution of 1918 as a terrible and humiliating tragedy caused by the Marxists and the Jews. When he later joined a reserve battalion in Munich, he felt repugnance towards the soldiers' committees that had taken over the unit. After the Soviet revolt, Hitler began working for military intelligence. One day he was tasked with spying on a group of suspected socialists, but when he encountered this group, he was in for a surprise. The German Workers' Party was founded in 1919 by Anton Drexler. Drexler believed that Germany's hardship was caused by Bolshevism, which he attributed as a creation of the Jews. While he initially wanted to appease the lower middle classes, his long-term goal was to lure the proletariat away from Marxism and put them at the service of pan-Germanism. For such grand ideas, the party was pathetically small and seemingly without hopes of realizing its goals. On the 12th of September, 1919, Hitler attended one of its meetings at a local bar in Munich. One of the speakers began discussing the idea of Bavaria separating from the rest of Germany, becoming independent. Hitler, enraged at such an idea, began passionately countering the man with his own speech. Drexler was so impressed that he accepted Hitler into the party. While he initially joined because he was ordered to do so by his superiors, Adolf came to enjoy his newfound hobby in politics and eventually retired from the army. Hitler was an incredible speaker, especially when riled up, and was charismatic enough to instill admiration and loyalty into his followers. Unlike other far-right figures, Adolf's speeches were similar to those of socialist agitators, using simpler vocabulary which made him more appeasing to the common citizen. His speeches would start out calm and gradually increase in intensity until reaching its climax. It wouldn't take long for Mr. Edgy political guy to rise through the ranks and eventually surpassing Drexler in importance. The party was later renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party. The party also received a new flag designed by Hitler himself. Its backdrop was the color red, symbolizing the social idea of the movement, a white circle representing nationalism, and in that circle a black swastika, which stood for the struggle of the Aryan race. The party continued to grow, attracting plenty of servile little bitches like Rudolf Hess and opportunists like Hermann Göring, who, despite believing in National Socialism, was more self-interested than the people they hated most. The end goal of the National Socialists was to destroy all divisions between the left and the right that, according to them, were the result of Jewish manipulation, instead uniting everyone under the idea of a German nation or race. Hitler and his followers also believed that Germany was entitled to colonies, which they would obtain from conquering parts of Russia, a place inhabited by people they deemed as lesser than them. Now I'm sure that some of you have wondered if perhaps some of the anti-Jewish dogma spouted out by the Nazis may have some truth to it. What are you, fucking Down syndrome? Of course not. Going over their history, the Jews began arriving in Europe after the destruction of their temples in Jerusalem. They avoided intermingling with the rest of the population, largely out of their own volition, but part of that was imposed on them. The various states that they ended up in implemented laws to segregate them and forbid them from doing stuff such as owning land for cultivation and joining guilds. Because of this, they turned to jobs not controlled by guild regulations. This included medicine, trading, and money dealing. During the Enlightenment, laws against them became more lax and eventually resulted in their emancipation. With that, the Jews, in this case German Jews, began to better integrate themselves into broader society. Many of them married their Christian compatriots and even converted themselves. They began not to view themselves solely as Jews, but as Germans of the Jewish faith. However, there were still many people who looked at them with disdain and mistrust. On top of that, the late 18 and early 1900s saw the increase in pseudoscience that claimed that some races were inferior to others. After the banning of the Freikorps, there was suddenly a surplus of murderous radicals who were now looking for new jobs. The Nazis, being radicals and eventually murderous ones, were in need of their own assault detachments to defend their rallies and intimidate their opponents. In 1920, they formed the weirdly named Section of German Sports. This later became the SA, which would gain a reputation for its brutality. The creation of the SA was largely possible due to the contributions of Ernst, the Bane of Jews and Banger of Dudes, Röhm. Röhm was a veteran of World War I and a former member of the Freikorps that was well connected with the military. Rather than being interested in conspiracy theories, Röhm was attracted to violence, which he made a career of. He was also into gay sex, but we're just gonna ignore that part for now. Despite being one of his original followers, having joined the party in 1919, Röhm never fully fell under Hitler's spell, obtaining a level of independence. During October 1922, the Italian fascists led by Benito Mussolini had seized power after marching en masse to Rome. The not-so-intelligent Austrian man looked upon this event with admiration, hoping to one day do the same. The opportunity would arise in 1923 when, previously mentioned, the French occupied the Ruhr and inflation was high. The Communists, seemingly having not learned their lesson, revolted in Saxony, Thuringia, and the Rhineland. They failed, obviously. A nationalist group called the Black Reichswehr, who seemingly were as stupid as the Reds, attempted their own rebellion, which failed. Just before the nationalist revolt, the coalition government headed by the Social Democrats resigned on the 13th of August, and a new one was formed by Gustav Stresemann, a liberal of the right. Stresemann himself was in a difficult situation as the commander of the Reichswehr, General von Seeckt, was secretly scheming against him, causing his government to collapse. However, Stresemann soon replaced it with another one, and he himself had the position of Minister of Foreign Affairs. Before a date was set, the more servile Hermann Göring became the new head of the SA at the expense of the more independent Röhm. Hitler had hoped that the well-mannered Bavarian bourgeois that was Göring would improve the Nazi public image and tighten discipline within the ranks. Fearing that he'd lose support from the paramilitaries in Bavaria, and now having the support of the former General Erich von Ludendorff, Hitler decided that the time was right for a coup. On the night of November 8th, Hitler and a group of well-armed SA stormed into a beer hall that was hosting a meeting of local politicians. Hitler announced that the Bavarian government had been deposed and that the building was surrounded. Everyone inside was taken prisoner, including Gustav Kahr, who presided over the Bavarian government. After taking Kahr and a few others aside, he told them his plan. The Nazis were to march on Berlin and install Hitler as the head of government and Ludendorff as head of the army. Ludendorff, believing that he could trust Kahr, let him and some others go, to which they immediately contacted the police and the army. By the next day, assault detachments led by Röhm had successfully taken over the army and police headquarters, but failed to secure the barracks and other important buildings. With no turning back, Uncle Adolf met up with 2,000 of his troops the following day in Munich. Göring, Ludendorff, and a bunch of armed men, headed by Hitler, marched towards the Ministry of War with the determination to bring down the November criminals and make Germany great again. The dumbass really thought that walking into a bunch of police was a good idea. Hitler, Ludendorff, Röhm, and several others were detained while Göring fled to Austria like a little bitch. In total, 4 police officers and 14 Nazis lost their lives, with many more being injured. Hitler's trial began in February 1924. Considering he was being tried for high treason, he and his friends should have been fucking executed. But little did they know that luck was on their side. The justice system of the Weimar era was incredibly flawed, largely due to the biases of individual judges. Many judges viewed the new republic with disdain and considered laws enacted by legislative assemblies to be of compromise and lies. They favored the political right much more than the left, as they had previously persecuted the latter under the Kaiser. To put these biases into perspective, between the end of 1919 and the middle of 1922, 22 murders committed by the left had resulted in 38 sentences, including 10 executions, and jail time of an average of 15 years. On the other hand, the 354 murders committed by the right only resulted in 24 sentences, no executions, and an average of 4 months in prison. 23 right-wing extremists even straight up confessed their crimes, but were never punished. While these statistics probably aren't perfect, they do give us an idea of just how flawed Weimar democracy was. Ludendorff was absolved of any involvement, and Hitler took sole responsibility for the putsch. He was only sentenced to 5 years in prison, being given a comfortable cell and allowed as many visitors as he pleased. Even though this trial was condemned by both the left and the right, little was done about it. While incarcerated, Hitler dictated to his accomplice and fellow prisoner Rudolf Hess what would become Mein Kampf, the manifesto of a madman. After only a few months in prison, Hitler was released on the 23rd of December, 1924. His party was in a particularly tough situation and would need a new plan if they ever wanted to try to seize power again. During Adolf's absence, the SA had their weapons confiscated. Despite the attempts of Röhm, the SA began to fragment. Alfred Rosenberg, curious last name, was put in charge of the party for the meantime. However, Rosenberg was incapable of imposing his authority on the Nazis. Their one saving grace was that they did decent in the Second Reichstag elections of May 4th, 1924. Due to the occupation of the Ruhr and hyperinflation, extremist parties such as the Nazis and the KPD saw an increase in support. But during the following elections of December 7th, the National Socialist Freedom Party bloc fell by 3.5 percentage points. The overall situation of the Weimar Republic began to improve after some slight economic reforms. In September 1923, the government of Gustav Stresemann managed to negotiate an eventual French withdrawal from the Ruhr in exchange that Germany would assure reparations regardless of the costs. The international community, who were against France's actions, began to revise the amount that Germany was to pay. The Dawes Plan, which was implemented in 1924, was meant to facilitate Germany's payment of reparations. While it made things easier for the Germans, the far right was still immensely dissatisfied. The new director of Germany's central bank, Kammerstadt, emitted a new currency, the Rentenmark, then later the Reichsmark, which its value was tied to gold. The USA had also loaned Germany 800 gold marks, which helped give people confidence in the new currency and acted as a base for regular payments and reparations. Hyperinflation was now over and what we call the golden years of the Weimar Republic began. As with other countries, such as the US, German society and culture saw some new life injected into it. Dance clubs opened up all over Germany and brought in bands to play jazz. Instead of joining book clubs like a bunch of nerds, young people started going to these new establishments. Modernist art became increasingly popular. Painters such as Otto Dix, a veteran of World War I, captivated the public with his works that displayed the horrors of the Great War as well as the social issues of Weimar Germany, such as homeless disabled veterans begging for cash on the streets. German women also gained increased rights and benefits. Many more job opportunities were now available for them, giving many women a greater level of independence, and a few even became involved in politics. A little more controversial was the greater availability of contraceptive and a loosening of abortion laws, which no longer considered it a criminal offense, but a fault. Homosexuality, despite being illegal, became a lot more tolerated when compared to previous years. While they still kind of remained behind closed doors, gay clubs opened up all over Germany where the ancestors of the Argentinians got a little zesty. I wonder if Röhm ever took Hitler on a date there. That'd be kind of funny. Aside from clubs, scientific institutions formed by homosexuals, such as Magnus Hirschfeld, were propped up by state subsidies and began publishing works on the subject. As with any sudden change within society, there is always a negative reaction. Jazz was considered nigger music, modernist art was labeled as degenerate by the Nazis, pretty ironic considering it's coming from them. The advancement of women's rights and the facilitation of contraceptives was blamed for the declining birth rate, and, of course, homosexuality and sexual liberation was opposed by the older generations of society. Interestingly, it wasn't just the political right whom held these beliefs, but also the left. The KPD and the SPD even believed that the young people were drifting away from the traditional values of the proletariat movement. When Hitler eventually got out of jail, he was faced with a tough situation. While free, he was banned from speaking in public in almost every state till 1927 or 1928. On top of that, the SA and the rest of the party were made illegal. There was much disagreement within the party on how they should continue, rivalries between members such as Ludendorff and Streicher, and there were even small factions of nationalists claiming to be the successors of the National Socialists. Hitler basically had to rebuild the party from scratch. To start, he reconnected with many of its members and began to get rid of his rivals. To legally re-establish the SA, they were put under the direct supervision of the party and cut off ties with other paramilitaries, a decision that Ernst Röhm was against. Röhm was expelled and he later ended up suffering a fate worse than death. Röhm went to Bolivia. His reason for going was that he was hired as an advisor for the Bolivian army. It was also around this time that Hitler formed a new bodyguard unit, one that was more reliable and tightly under his control. This unit is infamously known by its initials, the SS. The ever-so-popular Ludendorff, now more extreme in his ideas, was becoming a threat. Ludendorff, in his infinite wisdom, decided that it was a great idea to run for president in the elections of 1925. He got 1.1% of the vote. Impressive. He failed so miserably that he stepped away from politics for the rest of his life. Going back to the 1925 elections, these occurred shortly after the death of Friedrich Ebert. The victor of this election was our old friend Paul von Hindenburg. The conservative and militaristic Hindenburg was a stark contrast to the social democratic Ebert. This turn of events marked the beginning of the end of the Weimar democracy, as the government would become increasingly more authoritarian. Not having much of a choice, the Nazis would have to gain power via elections, though that wouldn't stop them from using other illegal tactics to get there. Shortly after Hitler's release, the party was joined by a new member, Joseph Goebbels. He was introduced to the party by a local member from the Rhineland, quickly becoming a local organizer and a prominent speaker. Despite having a more pseudo-socialist twist to his beliefs, Goebbels was ultimately put under Hitler's spell and would serve as a useful tool for the Nazis. The party began reorganizing itself, setting up regional offices based along electoral lines. To further penetrate German society with their influence, they established the Hitler Youths and the League of German Girls for high school and university students. Many young men joined, motivated by the anti-intellectualism of the Hitler Youths and for the action, such as vandalizing walls with swastikas. Goebbels and Gregor Strasser attempted to win over the votes of the urban working class, but were unable as this group was either loyal to the SPD or the KPD. Instead, the Nazis turned their attention to the rural and Protestant population of northern Germany. There, they saw more success as the peasants, whom suffered partly due to foreign competition, were attracted to the Nazi idea of making Germany self-sufficient economically. The SS were also put under the control of Heinrich Himmler, a little weak-chinned man whom was just as servile as Goebbels and determined to redeem himself after missing out on World War I. Despite the Nazis recovering from the failed 1923 putsch, they were still nowhere near the seats of power, as no one wanted to vote for this little club of delusional radicals. But soon, Germany as a whole would become just as disillusioned as them after the stock market crash of 1929. The German economy was hit hard, especially in the industrial sectors such as Hamburg, Berlin, and the Ruhr, with unemployment going up to 5 million people between 1930 and 1931. Later in 1932, it was estimated to be at 13 million. Even if people didn't lose their jobs, many had to work less hours, thus receiving less pay. Even skilled workers were out of luck, often having no other choice but to work non-specialized jobs. Social Security was simply unable to provide for the unemployed population, and many, usually young men, resorted to crime as a way to sustain themselves. With this new wave of discontent, radical groups like the KPD and the Nazis saw an increase of votes during the 1930 Reichstag elections, receiving 13.1% and 18.3% respectively. The Communists even saw success at recruiting young semi-delinquents into their organization, giving the League of Red Front combatants the much-needed support in defending neighborhoods loyal to them. The SA, led once again by Röhm, and communist paramilitaries became increasingly violent, especially against one another. The Nazis intimidated and attacked anyone they didn't like, with many of their victims being murdered. Interestingly, they tended to avoid confrontations with the police, at least less often than the communists, though they still launched personal attacks towards police chiefs, especially if they were social democrats. Even after reconsolidating his control for the party, there were still differences amongst its members in wake of the stock market crash. Otto Strasser, along with others of the party's left wing, believed that Hitler had betrayed the socialist ideals of National Socialism. Hitler, who began trying to appeal to middle-class businessmen and intellectuals, expelled Strasser and his followers from the party. The former Reichstag coalition that gained power in 1928, led by the Social Democrat Hermann Müller, fell apart in 1930 after the SPD refused to cut Social Security spending. President Hindenburg appointed Heinrich Brüning as Chancellor of the Reichstag. Before the Nazis were even in power, Brüning's government began introducing authoritarian measures such as restricting civil liberties, resulting in the censorship of newspapers, and weakening the power of workers' unions and the Social Democrats, whom were the main proponents of democracy. His government also banned the use of political uniforms, and later paramilitaries, such as the SA, were made illegal. Obviously, the state of the economy was far more important than petty rivalries between politicians. Brüning reduced public spending in an attempt to control inflation. However, by 1931, things got worse as the Darmstadt and national banks went bankrupt after the withdrawal of financial support. Brüning was eventually replaced with Franz von Papen in 1932. One of the first things he did was convince Hindenburg to dissolve the Reichstag and call for new elections that would be held on the 31st of July. Papen and many others within the government had even convinced themselves that collaboration with the Nazis was needed to gain the support of the masses, and lifted the ban on the SA, believing that this would calm down the Nazis. This is what we call a big fucking mistake. Almost immediately, the SA flooded the streets and unleashed a never-before-seen level of violence against their enemies, with the dead and injured surpassing that of previous years. They even had the audacity to stroll through communist strongholds such as Altona, close to Hamburg, engaging in street brawls with thousands of members of the League of Red Front combatants. According to some reports, the communists had sharpshooters on the roofs, firing at the SA. When the police arrived, they began frantically shooting their revolvers at everyone. 18 people were killed and over 100 were injured. Papen, instead of taking responsibility, blamed this event on the Social Democratic government of Prussia and used this as a pretext to conduct a literal coup. On the 20th of July, heavily armed troops occupied the streets in cities such as Berlin. The Reichsbanner, loyal to the SPD, had a force of 200,000 members at this point for the sole purpose of defending the Republic. While they were willing to fight, they were heavily outnumbered by the Reichswehr, along with their auxiliaries, the SA and the Iron Helmets. Obviously, the KPD sure as hell wasn't going to help. The order to fight the coup was never given, as the SPD, committed with the principles of democracy, refused to do so. Papen's coup was essentially the last nail in the coffin for Weimar democracy, having destroyed the principles of federalism and opened the way for centralization of the state. It also convinced groups like the Nazis that their opponents on the left could be defeated with little resistance. Since the Reichstag had been dissolved by Papen, new elections were to be held later in July that year. The conservative government of Hindenburg had hoped to secure a majority for themselves. However, it was the Nazis who benefited most from this election, getting 37.4% of the votes. While the SPD lost a few votes, the KPD saw, just like the Nazis, an increase, getting 16.9%. While the Nazis did fairly well, Hitler was still somewhat disappointed in the results, as they had failed to steal the votes from the SPD and the Center Party, painting the picture that their brief electoral success had reached its peak. If they wanted to cement their control over the government, they would most likely have to form a coalition with other parties. Hitler, however, was not fond of the idea. The only way he would ever join a coalition government is if he'd be named Chancellor. Negotiations with the ruling parties wasn't made easier by the continued violence of the SA. In August, a group of SA brutally murdered a communist militant of Polish origin as he slept. Since Papen had previously passed a decree to impose a death penalty on people who murdered their political adversaries, the SA who perpetrated the murder were all arrested and were supposed to be executed. Hitler, throwing a hissy fit, called this an act of injustice while his thugs rampaged through the town where the murderers were detained, vandalizing Jewish businesses and attacking newspaper offices of their adversaries. This event became one of the subject of Hitler's negotiations with Papen and Hindenburg. Hindenburg was against the idea of making Hitler Chancellor, not because the guy was a lunatic, but because making the winner of the Reichstag elections Chancellor reminded him too much of democracy, which he was slowly dismantling. Papen, with the approval of Hindenburg, once again dissolved the Reichstag, but this time it was to remain closed permanently. However, when he tried to announce this to the members of the Reichstag when they met, Hermann Göring, who presided over the session, ignored him and instead convinced everyone else to vote in favor of censoring the communists. While the Reichstag was dissolved, Papen was forced to hold new elections in November. Despite the Nazis still remaining the largest party, the votes had dropped down to only 33.1%. Papen's actions were heavily criticized by everyone. Unable to stop the violence occurring in the streets, Papen resigned from his post as Chancellor, being replaced by Kurt von Schleicher. Hitler's refusal to join a coalition government garnered him quite a bit of criticism from within his own party. The main voice behind this criticism was Gregor Strasser. The breaking point for Hitler occurred when Schleicher began negotiating with Strasser independently without his approval. Trying to avoid a split in the party, Hitler acted swiftly, convincing as many people as possible that he was right and removing anyone untrustworthy, including Strasser. While Schleicher believed that the Nazis would eventually fall off as the economy improved, he didn't have time to wait. Once again, Hitler and Hindenburg were at the negotiation table. This time around, Hindenburg's advisors, one of them still being Papen, had convinced him that the Nazis could be used until they inevitably collapsed and could be replaced by more conservative allies. On the 30th of January, 1933, Hitler was sworn in as the Chancellor of the Reichstag. The Nazis were also given control of the Ministry of the Interior, now headed by Wilhelm Frick, and Göring was appointed as the Minister of the Interior of the state of Prussia, giving the Nazis direct control over most of the police in Germany. The result of the negotiations was celebrated by the Nazis with a joint parade of 18,000 SA and SS, 3,000 Iron Helmets, and 40,000 non-uniformed civilians who marched around Berlin, eventually passing by Hindenburg's residence. With thousands of armed thugs and the police and army neutralized, very little was in the way of the Nazis' eventual rise to power. Even though they continued to violently pursue their enemies, they need to legalize these measures to make them seem more legitimate in the eyes of the public. That opportunity soon came on the 27th of February, 1933, when the Reichstag was set on fire. The burning was blamed on the Dutch national Marinus van der Lubbe, who was of anarcho-syndicalist affiliation. Even though he was detained inside the Reichstag and the following investigation determined that he was acting on his own, the Nazis blamed the burning of the Reichstag on the communists and called for immediate action. At Hitler's request, Hindenburg signed the Reichstag decree, which suspended most civil liberties in Germany and gave the police and their nationalist auxiliaries considerable power. The current leader of the KPD, Ernst Thälmann, was caught off guard and arrested. Ernst Togler, leader of the communist representatives of the Reichstag, willingly gave himself in to refute the claim that they had caused the fire. 10,000 of its members were detained and their offices looted by the Nazis for anything of value. Even though thousands were detained and tortured in improvised detention centers, the KPD wasn't outright banned and was able to continue participating in elections. The last ever elections in Germany for a long time occurred on the 5th of March of that year. Unlike those in the past, it was far from fair. Aside from suppressing the KPD, armed members of the SA and the police patrolled the streets both before and during the elections, often barging into the houses of opposition supporters. After silencing the opposition, loudspeakers were set up in the major streets of cities, amplifying Hitler's speeches. Nazi militants also began shouting propaganda slogans and singing patriotic songs. The Nazis and their nationalist allies, unsurprisingly, obtained the majority of the vote, that being 51.9%. Despite the brutal repression of the party, the KPD managed to obtain 12.3% of the vote, while the SPD acquired 18.3%. Even under conditions of semi-dictatorship, the Nazis were unable to get an overwhelming majority. However, popular support isn't a requirement when you can rely on the jackboot. Repression against the KPD and the SPD continued. Their offices were sacked, supporters intimidated, members arrested, tortured, and killed. After Himmler was appointed president over the Provisional Police, members of the opposition, including an increasing number of non-leftists, were being rounded up under any pretext and sent off to the first concentration camps of the Nazi regime. Places that were affiliated with the Holocaust, such as Dachau, started off as detention centers for political prisoners. The conditions within the first camps were often described as a sadistic improvised anarchy. Unlike other regimes of the 20th century, such as Pinochet's Chile, torture was less sophisticated, consisting of mindless beatings to inflict as much pain rather than acquire confessions. Since the Reichstag hadn't been repaired, the first reunion of the parliament was to be held in the church of the Potsdam garrison on the 21st of March. Goebbels had planned the opening ceremony down to the last detail. The event was attended by lavishly dressed military officers and aristocrats, Protestant priests, prominent Nazis such as Hitler, and the president, Hindenburg. The whole thing gave off the impression that the old Reich had made a comeback, or that, at the very least, it was passing the torch to a new one. Needing something more practical, the parliament was moved to the Kroll Opera House. The building was decorated with flags of the swastika, and Hitler, dressed in his SA uniform, proposed the Enabling Law, which would give the Chancellor, that being him, the ability to introduce laws that defied the Constitution without the approval of the Reichstag. Since the Nazis controlled most of the seats, the Enabling Law was bound to be approved. Out of the 220 SPD representatives, only 94 were present, as many were detained or in hiding, while those of the KPD had their voting rights taken away from them by a constitutional amendment imposed by Göring. Even with the threat of imprisonment or even death, the SPD maintained firm in its opposition to the proposition. Otto Wels, one of the Social Democrats present, defended the contributions that the Weimar Republic had made for Germany. Realizing that they had lost in the present, he looked to the future. In this historic hour, we, the Social Democrats of Germany, solemnly proclaim our fidelity to the basic principles of humanity and justice, liberty, and socialism. No enabling law will give you the right to destroy ideas that are eternal and indestructible. The anti-socialist law didn't annihilate the Social Democrats. Social democracy can still extract new strength from new persecutions. We salute the oppressed and the persecuted. Your firmness and loyalty are worthy of admiration. The valor of your convictions, your unbreakable confidence, give hope for a brighter future. 444 voted in favor of the enabling law, with 94, most likely all the Social Democrats, voted against it. Following this, the SPD and their allies in the workers' unions were once again targeted by the Nazis, forcing many of its members to go into exile. On the 23rd of June, the SPD was outright banned. Other political factions, such as the Centre Party, had long given up on democratic principles as the church began favoring authoritarian measures to fight the rise of communism. After several of their members, such as Eugene Vogt, were subjugated to mistreatment while in custody, the Centre Party dissolved itself after the Nazis promised they'd give the Catholic Church a level of independence. Nationalist and right-wing factions were also subjugated. The Iron Helmets, whom had fought side by side with the SA, were forcibly integrated into the SS. The Jewish community of Germany, whom had very little ways to protect themselves, were now at the mercy of the Nazis. Aside from the typical street violence, they were now being kicked out of public office. Judges and lawyers were the first to be fired, and on the 28th of March, the Nazis ordered a boycott of all Jewish businesses. Persecution of the opposition was further facilitated by the creation of the Gestapo, commanded by Göring, whose job was to survey the acts and thoughts of the populace while having the power to send people to concentration camps without trial. Hitler's vision of Germany was slowly being imposed onto the nation. Despite having almost total control of the state and the police, Hitler would once again have to deal with the internal divisions of his party. The SS had become Hitler's preferred group of thugs to do his dirty work. The SS, led by Himmler, also had a rivalry with the SA, led by Röhm. Members of the SS considered themselves superior than their SA counterparts, as they had their racial pedigree investigated before joining. But the nail in the coffin for the SA was that Röhm's and Hitler's visions for the organizations differed greatly. Hitler wanted the Reichswehr to continue being Germany's standing army, while Röhm wanted to combine the two organizations and form a new one that he would command. The Reichswehr also stated that if the SA were not put under control, then Hindenburg would be forced to declare martial law and had power over to the army. Needing an excuse to get rid of Röhm, Himmler began fabricating a conspiracy of a supposed SA rebellion and presented the evidence to the army. On the night of June 30th, 1934, Hitler purged the last vestiges of opposition within his party during the so-called Night of the Long Knives. Hitler personally flew to Munich and then to Weisse, where Röhm was staying. Despite not really wanting to kill him, Hitler personally oversaw the arrest of Röhm and some of his fellow SA members, such as Edmund Heinz, who was caught sleeping with another man. Röhm was locked in a room, given a pistol, and told to execute the sentence himself. Refusing to do so, he was instead shot by two guards. Despite being one of Hitler's earliest followers, and even a close friend, he was put down like a dog for being a political inconvenience. Personally, I like to believe that it was because Röhm never took Adolf on a date to one of those Berlinese gay clubs. Aside from arresting and killing members of the SA, the Nazis also went after people outside of the party. Papen was arrested. Schleicher was not so lucky, being killed along with his wife. Most of Hitler's enemies were now exiled, imprisoned, or dead. The only obstacle now was President Hindenburg, but all they'd have to do was to wait for the old man to die. On the 2nd of August, 1934, Paul von Hindenburg passed away at the age of 87. Before Hindenburg even breathed his last breath, the position of President and Chancellor were combined into a single post that Hitler would occupy, soon giving himself the title of Führer. The Reichswehr, which had for so long insisted on remaining neutral, put up no resistance when Hitler asked them for their loyalty. Previously, the soldiers had sworn an oath of loyalty to the Constitution, but now it was for loyalty to the Führer. I swear by God, this sacred oath, that I will render unconditional obedience to Adolf Hitler, the Führer of the German Reich and nation, the supreme commander of the armed forces, and that I shall be ready, as a brave soldier, to lay down my life at any time for this oath. At the party congress held in Nuremberg, Hitler declared that the National Socialist Revolution was at an end, proclaiming what he believed was the start of an empire that would last for 1,000 years. The Weimar Republic was born in one of Germany's darkest hours. Overcoming war, revolution, and economic downturn while trying to construct a parliamentary democracy at the same time is a task that any nation would struggle to achieve. Combine all that with the fact that the transition from empire to republic wasn't very smooth, German society simply wasn't ready for it. As we've seen, large segments of the population were nostalgic for the past, while others were willing to put aside civil liberties to construct their vision for the future. In all honesty, it was doomed from the start. Taking down a democracy made up of people who could care less about it wasn't particularly difficult for a group like the Nazis, whom were willing to use any method to do so. The dissatisfaction with the Republic was arguably the most influential factor that led people to support the Nazis. It wasn't their vision, program, ideology, or anti-Semitism that led people to vote for them, but the fact that they were a party of protest. Combine that with the charisma and willpower of a man like Hitler, they were able to transcend class boundaries and unite people of all walks of life under the idea of a broader German race. The only possible way that they could have been defeated is if they were all shot or imprisoned for disobeying law on countless occasions. Claiming that the Nazis seized power through legal means is like claiming that Argentinians aren't gay, something that is simply factually incorrect. Even if defeated, the alternatives for Germany weren't looking too good. The far left, influenced by Moscow, wanted a Soviet-style government, which probably would have resulted in the same communist tyranny as seen in Russia. The far right wanted a more traditional and militaristic style of government, one that was bound to cause a war in the future. The greatest lesson to be learned from the Weimar Republic is that having sex with your cousin can have dire consequences.
Oh. Mm. No crackers, Gromit. We've forgotten the crackers.